Hi, everybody. This is Angelella Editorial. I'm going to go around and have everybody introduce themselves, starting with Jay.
Hi, I'm Jay Whistler. I have been editing with Angelella Editorial for about, 6 months now, Kate, I think. Yeah,
That sounds about right.
yeah. And I do mostly YA and middle grade editing.
And Jay, are you reading anything or watching anything that you are particularly enjoying recently? If everybody wants to just let us know what they're reading or watching.
Right now I am listening to the audiobook of Amy King's A.S. King's Dig, and it's amazing. It's just she writes for people who aren't aware, she writes very surreal YA stories, and this one is no exception. And some of the character names are just really fun, like the shoveler, the freak, can I help you? Those are the character names, and we never learn their real names. Those are their real names. And one of the characters has a flea circus, like a literal flea circus that she carries around in a lunchbox. It's like, who does this? So it's an amazing novel, and it's heartbreaking. It's funny. It really gets to what matters to teenagers, and the traumas that they have to go through and deal with, and how that affects them emotionally. It's very powerful.
That sounds awesome. Thanks, Jay. Suma?
Hi, I'm Suma, and uh, I work with Angelella Editorial too, and I critique picture books, middle grade as well as young adult. And the book that I just finished reading, and I will be talking about in our chat too, is Amal Unbound by Aisha Saeed. So this book is about it's a compelling story about a girl's fight to regain her life and dreams after being forced into resistance and fighting for justice in her country, Pakistan. So that's the book I've been reading, and it's just wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you, Suma. Denise?
Hi, I'm Denise, and what am I reading right now? Well, I actually just finished today the season of Styx Malone by Kekla Magoon. Really, really enjoyed it. It was just such a fun book and an interesting book, and just really loved it. And I also just finished the 57 Bus by
That's so good.
It's so good. It's so good. I want to talk a little bit about it actually from an angle of nonfiction openings a little bit later. But I didn't start with, am also an editor with Angelella Editorial, and I mostly focus on middle grade and YA fiction, but I also do a little nonfiction in the form of personal essays and anything for presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. And Jen Bailey. Are you there, Jen?
I am. Am I?
Please introduce yourself and let us know what you're reading or watching that you're really enjoying.
Hi. Sorry. So I had like hounds. I was wrangling outside, and time slipped away as we were all barking at the dogs that passed by. So I'm Jen Bailey, and what am I reading? I'm actually reading Monstrous Devices. It's really fantastic. It was a little slow to start. I was like, where is this going? Because it had some great blurbs on the back. And we've just hit a place that's like, ooh, lovely. And it's still early days. So, but so far, really, really enjoying it. Finished the Umbrella Academy. Heart. I think it's well worth playing with and getting involved in.
Is Monstrous Devices, is that, what age level is that? I haven't heard
That's
of
middle grade. And boy, I hope that I got that right.
Okay.
Once I like pull it off the TBR pile, like sometimes the title I do that with the title. But yeah, that was it's been good. It's been really good. I actually just finished the front desk.
Oh, yeah.
Too. I cannot remember the author. I'm sorry, folks, but that was really great. That was a fascinating view at the immigrant experience, because a lot of it is based on the author's life, and it's kind of like, really, we're really that horrible. Just like, wow, okay, but lovely. So I enjoyed that one a lot. I got that from that was a recommendation. I was out in Portland with Jay and with some other folks, and I went to Green Bean Books, and they recommended that one, and I recommend Green Bean Books. Amazing, adorable little shop. And you walk in and you say, give me something I haven't read. And they're like, what did you read last? And you tell them, they're like, oh, well, now you have to try this because it's completely different. And it's...
Oh, that's awesome. That's why you can't replace independent bookstores.
Correct.
Right.
Well, thank you for introducing yourself, Jen. I'm glad to have everybody here to talk about how to nail the opening to your novel. It's a really big topic of conversation. It's something that is very important to hook your reader. And in traditional publishing, aspiring first-time authors to hook the agents so that you can find representation, you can get requests on that book. A lot of times you have a really great book and you just don't know exactly how to start it. So you miss out on the request because your opening chapter is not the right representation of the rest of your novel. So we are here to talk about what can we do to make sure that you have the perfect opening to your novel. And I think that I'd like to just open it up to, I'm Kate Angelella, by the way. And I just finished Heart in a Body in the World, which is by Deb Caletti, and it was edited by my former boss at Simon & Schuster, who is Lisa Abrams, and she is wonderful and is just like the writer's editor of your dreams. She's somebody who cares a lot about the audience that your books are going out to, and so I'm not at all surprised that she was the editor of this particular novel, which was just a standout book and a Prince Honor winner, and it deserves all of the accolades that it's gotten. And I'm going to be talking about that today too. So let's start by just talking about, what do you all look for in the first chapter of any good book?
Well, I think the first thing that I look for is I want character voice. I want to know who's talking to me right away, and feel that I'm getting to know this character right away. There's Buggles. I also want to, if we're getting ordinary world, which some people say you should start ordinary world, we need to see the ordinary world, and some people say you should start in media res, which means right in the middle of a scene. And either one is fine, but it has to be the right thing for your story. But if we're going to start in the ordinary world, that doesn't mean that it needs to be boring. I still want to see something exciting about this world, something to keep my attention. I also want to see some tension in there, and I want to see at least the beginning of the stakes. I want to see that there's a hint that stakes are to come. So, character voice, an exciting ordinary world, or a non-boring ordinary world, tension and stakes. Those are the things that are really important to me.
I think it's really important to me to see some hint of a desire line starting. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a desire that we like see throughout, but having the character want something, you know, anything, and have a unique desire to go after that thing. And I think also in connection with that, seeing at the very beginning the way they're responding to the things that are happening and the choices that they're making as a result. I think that kind of work doesn't have to wait until several chapters in. You can see hints of that character's traits in the first chapter and the first couple pages in just the way that they're responding to the way a character approaches them or something somebody says. We get little hints about who that character is, which attaches a reader to a story. It makes the reader want to continue reading that story because we now have an attachment to a unique character rather than a general idea of something.
I'd like to piggyback on what Denise just said, because for me, that's exactly it. I need at least a beginning of a reason to care. It's like I want to know, okay, all right, so you've got this and this is happening. Sometimes when we start with too much action, it's just that it's too much going on, or we meet too many people and it becomes a laundry list. I want something to connect with, somebody that I can follow, some point of view that I am either getting behind or opposing, quite honestly. So either a reason to care or a reason to think, no, you're not the person that I'm going to fall in love with, but let me figure you out. So there's that little something that makes them more than just a trope.
I agree with everything the wise people here said. So it all comes down to voice, character, and desire. And I also look for moments. So when I think of story openings that really deeply affect me, sometimes I don't immediately recall the whole story or all of the characters. Rather, I remember specific highlights or moments that really burn so brightly that something inside of me is illuminated and I want to be able to read further, and it's forever seared into my memory. One of the things that Aisha Saeed does in her novel Amal Unbound, which is the novel that I just talked to you about, that I just finished reading, is that we immediately know that the character has a love for learning and intelligence, and she cares for her friends because it's set in the school classroom. And that's not all. The author actually ties the surroundings of a rural Pakistan village, which is very easy to imagine. For example, she has a sugarcane maze, and then there are roses that are planted around Amal's grey house, and also, there is another character who actually lives in a mansion in a sunken little room. So these are details that you just remember, and the author conveys them organically to the reader without traces of exoticism. So that's what I look for. I look for moments that deeply affect me, and things that I recall and go back to reading in the story more and more.
I think that's a good point that Suma brings up, and I'd like to talk about that just for a second. When we talk about setting, you can Google, what do you need to have in an opening chapter, and it will give you a list of all these things. But why do you guys think setting is such an important part of that opening to the novel, the opening chapter?
I think it just sets you up for what you can expect. It's a promise, really, of what we're getting ourselves into. And if it's lacking, or if it's a lie, that becomes a real problem later on in the book. You can see a cover, you can read the jacket flap, you can do it's that first chapter. I remember, when I was picking books as a younger person, that I would always read the first paragraph as well before I purchased a book, because I'm a magpie with the cover. I love to see something really intriguing, and a jacket flap can kind of give you an idea. But that first paragraph, that first chapter even, I remember sitting there entranced until I'd finished the first chapter of the first Harry Potter book. And I was like, this is the journey I want. I must go here. Because it was a promise. And I think that a lot of it was the setting. You think that first chapter is not at all where we spend our time. We spend our time at Hogwarts, and yet we're on Privet Drive. But we've been given the world. And so I think that that's part of it.
I think setting is crucial for also jumping on that idea, Jen, sort of that idea of point of view, you know, understanding your characters, not point of view in the way we think of like first person, past, present, but like the actual way they view the world, their actual point of view of the world, I think is so determined by when and where they are. You know, there's certain pieces of knowledge that people wouldn't have been able to have access to, you know, in certain time periods. I'm thinking really specifically about like historical fiction. Historical fiction is so tied to where are you and when are you, and how does that influence the story? And I think that something that all writers can really pull from historical fiction writing is that idea of how the where you are and when you are influences your character, massively influences your character. And having an understanding of that, you can see the perspective and the lens through which they view the world. And so getting an idea of that at the beginning, it quite literally grounds you. And I think that too, the setting is so important at the top because we don't want to spend the whole time trying to figure that out. That's going to pull you out of the story. We want to be able to get into the desire lines and get into the character development. So you get the setting at the beginning to get it out of the way almost so that you can focus in the rest of the story toward your actual characters' motivations and desires and stakes and those sorts of things.
And so, go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say the other thing that setting does is it creates a mood. Depending on what your setting is, you get a mood. Like the Graveyard book, there is a mood in that setting, in that those very first pages about, you know, there was a knife there was a hand in the dark and it held a knife and the knife was wet, and you know, like and I don't remember exactly what the first line is, but that's pretty darn close. And there is a mood created with that setting, and then we walk through the house for a few minutes with the narrator, and we know this is really creepy. This is not a happy place. Something bad has happened here and will continue to happen here. And you have setting, and Neil Gaiman says nothing about. There is no mention of blood. There is no mention of murder. There is no mention, you know, he never says the word killing or any of those things. We know all of those things have happened. That mood is created simply by what he has said about setting.
That's an excellent point, and especially in middle grade when you have to be pretty careful about how you set that up. That's a perfect example of showing a hint of all of those elements without being explicit about it. Good point.
Right.
And you also said something about ordinary world in the beginning, Jay, and I'd like to go back to that because I think it's so important. I think a lot of people hear ordinary world and react to it in a negative way because of the word ordinary. And you did point out the excellent point that it doesn't mean that what's going on in the first chapter has to be ordinary or dull or boring. I'd like to talk a little bit about what ordinary world is, other than, you know, pointing out the fact that we're not talking about ordinary world, we're talking about the literary device ordinary world when we're saying that phrase. So let's talk a little bit about what is it defined, and if anybody has any examples of ordinary world as we're talking about it to kind of help illustrate what we're saying.
Well, I have to say, when you first when you first mentioned Ordinary World, I immediately thought of Hero's Journey. Which if you do a Google search for Hero's Journey, you'll get all sorts of stuff. But they talk about it more of in the known world and then in the unknown world, is sort of how it's referred. And I kind of like that because I think that it gets more into the idea of like what is known for your character and what's ordinary, like what is the regular status quo world for your character as opposed to what they're going into, which is the unknown. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a physical world. Some of my favorite stories are when the unknown or the sort of extraordinary or next level is internal, is emotional, and they have to go into sort of an unknown emotional world and explore that a little bit. One example that I actually thought of sort of ordinary to non-ordinary world is a picture book. I'm going to get this wrong. The Adventures of Beekle? No, what is it? The Unimaginary Friend. Jen, you would know it. What is it?
I know. It's like not that you said.
What is it? Hang on, I'm going to look it up to get the exact name. The Adventures of Beekle, the Unimaginary Friend. His ordinary world is the imaginary.
Dan Santat's, right? Dan Santat's book?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, it's Dan Santat. Yeah.
It's an amazing book.
It's an amazing book, and it starts in the imaginary world, and then he goes to the human world. So the imaginary world is actually the ordinary world. So it's the known world. And when he travels to what is our ordinary world, it's his unknown. It's his, sort of what is going to happen world. And I love that as an example of showing that it doesn't necessarily have to be like reality versus fantasy, that it can sort of, you can flip that on its head a little bit.
I like to think, I think that's a great point about emotion too, and I like to think of it in terms of what is ordinary for your character, because it doesn't mean what is ordinary for most people. So what is for your character? And there's a book that it's called What She Left Behind. And the first chapter is basically about this girl who is waiting for her mother to give her the signal that they're about to run from her abusive father. And she has a bag packed under her bed, and it's her go bag. And she's literally waiting for her mother to text her and say, "We're going." And she's she knows her father's schedule, she knows her mother's schedule. Her mother told her today was the day that we were going to go. But this is her life. Her life is waiting. Her life is waiting for her father to go off. Her life is waiting for her mother to make a move. It's been like this every day. Every day her mother says, "We're going to leave today." And every day her mother chooses not to. So this is her life. This is her ordinary world. But you have emotion, you have tension, you have stakes, all of that in that ordinary world. And it's incredible. I mean, like by the end of that first chapter, you are hooked, you are in. And it's phenomenal. And then by contrast, there's another book, Before I Fall, by Lauren Oliver, which this is one that it violates everything that we tell you not to do. We tell you don't start with the alarm going off. Don't start with, taking a shower and having breakfast and getting ready to go to school and catch the bus and all of that. That is exactly what Lauren Oliver does. But the reason she does it is that the concept of this book, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day. The main character lives this day over and over and over and over until she gets the day right. And so this is her ordinary world, and yet it changes every day. So we need to see how the first day is, and then how does the second day change, and then the third day, and then the fourth day, and then the 100th day. How do these days change? So we absolutely have to see how she wakes up in the morning, how she treats her mother when she gets up in the morning, how she treats her little sister, how she treats her father. All of these things are really important in that ordinary world. Okay, I'm done. I'll shut up now.
No, absolutely. Those were all really good points. And I like what you said too about, I'm thinking about, has anybody read All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven?
Yes. Oh my God, I love that book.
I just started it, and it's such a good book so far, and I was thinking of this cat when I was reading it, because it starts where the main character is hanging out on the bell tower about to jump, and he sees one of his classmates there, and she is about to jump as well. And it seems like it's violating that ordinary world thing, but it's not, because this is his ordinary world. He's there often. This is a regular occurrence for him. You later see him go to the guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor is like, are we going to deal this again? Do I have to call your mother type of thing? You find out this is normal for him, but so it's not necessarily having to start out in a way that's dull. It's just having to set up something that is routine for your character, their routine lives.
I think that David Levithan's Every Day is a fantastic example of that as well. It's because every day changes. Every day our protagonist, our main character, is somebody new in somebody's life. And so his every day is blending in. His every day is putting the pieces together so he can let his host live the life they're supposed to live that day, until he decides that he's going to start taking some actions. It's a fascinating story, I think. I really enjoyed it. You get that ticking clock element too. Like after 24 hours, it's all new again. And yet it's his every day. Or I shouldn't say his, it's the main character's every day. Known world.
Now, I'd like to add to that. Ordinary world, everyone defined it so well, so I'm not going to even go there because it's already done. I think another example is, a good example is The One and Only Ivan by Katherine Applegate. So as soon as the novel opens, we're immediately in the ordinary world of the gorilla. He's in a dull cage in a roadside shopping mall, and as we read one page after the other, we know that he's been trapped in this mall since he was a child. And that's not all. He's also been living with humans for almost all his life. And we know that he's also got in trouble. Like, he breaks a TV, and then a crib, and then I don't know, 40 or 50 glasses or something like that. So, the author really does a fantastic job of showing that, Ivan is a gorilla, but he's treated like a human child. And, even when and then as we progress in the story, towards the end, we know that, when he lived with his gorilla family, he always took mud and drew on rocks, and he was also named Mud. But then the author paints all of that right in the beginning, when we know that Ivan is also an artist when he interacts with a human child, and the child gives him crayons to draw with. Those are, again, small tidbits and context that the readers start wondering right at the beginning about why this action is happening and who's involved and what outcome should we be rooting for. I think confused readers might stick with us for a few pages, but if the opening does not introduce the ordinary world and then gives us more questions than it answers, then readers are likely to abandon the story and move on to the next book. Some of the things that we can't possibly include in the ordinary world is sequence a mirror or a foreshadow, or lead logically into something that will happen later in the story, which is what Katherine Applegate does. And so that's why we talk about the ordinary world, and then the inciting incident, and then what Denise mentioned. It's all part of that hero's journey. And who was the author again? Christopher. What was who was
Vogel?
Christopher Vogler? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, Vogler, yeah.
yeah.
So
Well, I
that's
think oh, sorry, I was just going to say, Suma, I think you bring up a good point of like, the planting bits and all of this. I think it's important to point out that like, I think most writers go back and rewrite their first chapters after they're done with their book.
Correct.
And I think that it's an important step in the writing process, because if you don't have that clear ending and you don't have that clear element of what you're lining up, how do you know what needs to go in that first chapter that you're setting up for the whole book, right? So I think it's a good point to point out that a lot of the stuff we're talking about is really good things to think about in revision, and that you can know it sometimes going into a book and then you're just tweaking, but that I think it's completely acceptable and expected that this process of sort of going back and tweaking that beginning for Ordinary World, for Seeds and Plants, that's revision work in its best, funnest way.
And if I might just jump into that. So I know like new writers and even old writers are going to be saying, so I have to build a whole world in one chapter. I have to set the stage for everything in one chapter. And it's like, no, you have to give us, as I stated before, you have to give us a promise of what is going to be happening. You have to still intrigue us. It's because I can see that it becomes a place where you're like, oh my gosh, all it is stage setting. All it is and we put a tree here and we build a house here and this is what the house looks like. And readers need to remember that when they're talking through their main character's view, the main character is only going to recognize or talk about what either is different or what is important to them. And so we won't get all of that stage decoration or all of that calling their brother by their first name, which they probably never do for most days, unless they're mad at them or, there's multiple siblings. Anyway, it is a fine line, and I think it's one that, as Denise said, works best in revision. Once you've told yourself the story, once you understand what's happening, now you need to go back and you probably need to start pulling things out so it's not dull. And so what we're learning is, as I said, what's either new to the character, what's important to the story, how does it become new to the character? Why is your character looking at this? If this is their everyday, why are they paying attention to it today? So I think it's an interesting line. It can feel tricky, but I'm sure that people can get it.
Jen, I actually had a book rec when I heard you talking about that, A Northern Light by Jennifer Donnelly. She does a really good job, and this goes beyond kind of openings. This goes into just what you're talking about of like importance and what you see. All of the historical markers in that book are connected with her desire line to get out of her hometown and move to a city. So everything that you see that's historical is connected to that. And so she's noticing those things, and it's giving us those historical markers without it like being in your face, right? Which is setting that time period and focusing on setting. But she's talking about those things because it's connected to her desire, because it's connected to what she wants and what she's going after. So if anyone's looking for a good book to sort of study how someone can do something like historical markers just as setting, that's a really good really good book for that.
Those are all really great points. And Jen, I think what you were saying about why does this matter? Why is this? Why are we noticing, or why is our main character noticing the ordinary world all of a sudden is a really good point too. And it's something that I hadn't necessarily thought about before you said it exactly that way. Your character is typically the one that's telling the story. So it's worth considering. And Denise too, I think that's a very smart way of looking at it, because I think as editors, we can get into a habit of saying, well, I looked at the opening of the story and this is what it's missing, and we have a checklist of things. But to the author, it can feel like, how am I supposed to incorporate all of those elements, and how am I supposed to know how to do all of those things? And I think the checklist can feel like a checklist sometimes. I think it's harder to implement when it's your story, and it can feel really overwhelming, but there's a sense of nuance that I think sometimes gets lost. It doesn't have to be quite so checklisty. Did you guys have any suggestions on how to go about incorporating these elements without it feeling like such a daunting task?
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback on. I'm going to piggyback on what you said, Kate, and also Denise and Jen, because we already discussed about voice and setting and character and also context a little bit. And one of the things that we could consider is genre. Now, for example, genres like thriller or science fiction or even romantic suspense to a certain degree, they lend themselves to action-forward openings and ordinary worlds. But readers of literary fiction and historical fiction, they expect to thoroughly be introduced to the character and setting and the situation conflict when they read the first chapter. So I think one way to go about this is considering the genre and also the reader expectations, as well as the novel's overall structure when you're crafting the opening and the ordinary world.
That's a good point.
I think that's a really good point. And, and when I say no, I don't have any advice on this, I think the reason that I feel that way is because every opening chapter is going to be different, and the combination of things that you need in that chapter is going to be different. I don't think that we can't, like you said, you don't want to go through a checklist, but you also don't want to forget anything on that checklist. And it's a matter of what does this character, this story, this plot, what does it all require? And it's not something that you can prescribe. And as an editor, it's just kind of, well, when we get into it, we can kind of tell, oh, this might be missing, or that might be missing, or yeah, it looks like they went through a checklist and they tried to cram everything in here, and maybe we don't need everything in here. So I think it's just keep writing, because the more you write, the more you discover what your particular story needs. And you also get better at understanding with every story you write, not just in the one story that you're working on right now, but with every story that you write moving forward, you will get better and better at figuring out what it is that your opening needs.
I think you bring up a good point, Jay, of just keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. I mean, I think that there's an ongoing joke amongst writers of like revising your first chapter 25 times. I know that in the current novel I'm working on, I think I've had about 17 different openings for this book. I think I finally figured out the right one. But the point is that, sometimes it can take a little while to get to that opening, to get to that understanding. And I think, like you said, it's different for every book, and it's different for every story, and it's different for every writer of how you get there too. I think the only thing I think probably that's universal is if your opening just feels off, go back to character again and again and again. What does your character want? What are they fighting for? And like use that as a jumping off point and play around with potential openings. Start at someplace, play. Like I think a lot of it is comes back to playing. We don't play enough. It's like, no, I got to get it right. This is the right thing, and sometimes you just got to play around and try writing it in a whole different perspective, and writing it, you know, in a whole different point of view, writing it in third person, writing it in first, writing it in second, past, present, like go all over the place with it and see what ends up feeling right. I feel like when I finally found, for my current book that I'm working on, when I finally found the right beginning for it, I think I actually cried at the end of writing that scene. So I was like, it finally, oh, and I think that's, I would, you know, jump out on a limb here to say that a lot of writers feel that way when they finally write the beginning of the book that feels right. It's like, yes, you feel it in your bones. It's like, yes, I finally got that, right?
Well, who was it? It was Richard Peck, wasn't it, who said that he writes his whole story and then he goes back and he takes chapter 1 and he completely ditches it and he rewrites it.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't even look at the first chapter that he had written before. He just rewrites it from scratch, because he knows that whatever he had in there in the beginning is now useless, because the whole story has now revealed itself to him, and he understands that whatever he thought he needed before, that's it, no longer relevant. He has to go back in there and figure out now what's the new opening. So
Well,
I think that's another way to look at it too.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I love listening to you people. You're all very clever. It's so often I think that when we're writing that beginning, we're telling ourselves the story. And that's not necessarily telling our reader the story. We're trying to get a handle on it ourselves. And that's why you need to go back. Once the story's all laid out there, once it's there, then you're like, okay, now what do I need to be telling the reader? And this is where I would caution authors, though, is sometimes now that it's all up here, you're not getting what's necessary on the page. So it's not just a matter of pulling it all out. I mean, I absolutely agree. Who would deny, Richard Peck, that you are going to write it over again? But don't forget that your reader doesn't know everything you know yet. I read that a lot. So there are those two openings I'm sure you all see a lot too. One that tries to paint that huge, vivid picture where you're quite honestly bored to tears because you don't know what's important. You don't know what you need to know as the reader, and you're just trying to find somebody to connect with. And then there's the other one where it's so spare. You're lost. You see talking heads, and you feel like you're floating around in a nothing land because you just, once again, you don't know who to connect to. You don't know what the anchor is. And this is where I think, as you've all talked about, making sure to bring in some character is incredibly important. If your character is snarky, well, a snarky character is going to notice the obvious in a snarky way. And they're, just like every day, Pete Phillips is once again trying to score with Amanda Plummer. And it's, and they're going to comment on it, and they're going to make that point. And so that's great. You're learning your world. But if you've got a shy child, let's say, or somebody who's just an observer, they're going to be looking in all these other ways. And so you have to bring character in because it develops what's important in our world.
Excellent points all. And it's a good segue into my next question, which is, what are the most common problems? I think for me, I often experience what Jen was just mentioning, of either way too much information in the first chapter or not nearly enough. What about you?
Yeah, the info dump. The info dump definitely is a big issue. And I think that falls right into the category that Jen was talking about of the author telling themselves the story. And just making sure that they get everything out on the page, and I don't want to leave anything out, and trying to fulfill that checklist. And then that's where it's the editor's job to help the author figure out what you need and what you don't need. And not every author needs an editor's help with this. You can go through and you can do this on your own as well. But I'm just saying that, from my point of view as an author, that's my job, is to help the author figure that out.
Yeah, I think Jen pretty clearly covered it, with everything you said. I think that, one of the things I pulled from what you said that I think is super important, that I think is hard sometimes to get, is what's important to the character. Why do we need to know this, and how does what the author's giving us right now feed into the rest of the story? How is it setting up the patterns in the story that we're going to follow? How is it planting those seeds that are going to grow into beautiful flowers later? Having an understanding of that, I think, can be sometimes really hard. It can take a little while to get there. And so figuring out again, going back to character, I feel like I'm a, broken record, but yeah, character, like what is important to your character? What do they want? Trying to get those in those first chapters is, I think, super important.
And what's at stake if they don't get what they want?
Yeah.
And that can change from that first chapter.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
But we need to get
yeah, go ahead.
To see them making choices.
Mm-hmm.
To I think that so often I say this as a writer, being completely guilty of it myself, of things happening to my characters rather than my characters being actively making choices about things, actively going after something or doing something. I think that's a huge line to sort of walk when you're working in your first couple chapters.
I would add that when you're creating openings and you're going back and you're revising them, one thing that you want readers to be asking is concrete questions. For example, who stole the Statue of Liberty? Or why did Cinderella order glass slippers a size too large, or whatever? So you don't want them asking for what's going on here, or even worse, they don't even understand what's going on. So you want to be just wary of creating false suspense, and that can be fixed by just not having readers floundering around the basics of the scene. For example, what is this character's name? So in other words, you want to get your readers to bond with your characters really early. The other is, how old is this person? Now, you don't have to spell out your every character's age, but if you're writing about an 80-year-old, you don't want to give the readers a chance to imagine he's only 17 or 15. So, and then also, who is this person? Readers need to know about your character, like Denise said, from the beginning. So this could be a personality trait or something that defines an action that is associated with the reader, and that's something that the reader will look forward to as they read the story. The other thing is, where is the scene taking place? We talked about setting already. So we don't want... readers would want to know where exactly it's taking place, if it's in a cafe or a forest or a bedroom or an airplane or, I don't know, home. And who is the character interacting with? They just don't... you don't give the reader too much work the first time you introduce your character. Because they keep reading, because you want to keep them reading.
I think
I like the way you say that. Don't give the character too much work. That's a great way to summarize it.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, Jay, as it relates to, somebody said earlier, too many characters. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when we get too many characters, we don't know who to follow. We don't know who's important, and it can be hard to keep them straight. If you introduce them all and then you just kind of go along as though we know them, that can be really hard to follow. But I was also thinking about Shakespeare, about how in the first like section of any Shakespearean play, you're usually finding out about what's happening in the world. There's this big explanation. Now, I don't think that you should do that necessarily in novels, but I think part of why it's there is to give the audience an opportunity to get into the play. You know what I mean? To give them an opportunity to get used to this and to settle into what's about to happen. And get used to the language too. People didn't talk like that. He wrote like that, but that's not necessarily how people were talking at the time. And so it also gave them an opportunity to get used to the language that was being used. And so that when you get into the actual story, you're already accustomed to that. So I think that the beginning of any story should do that as well. It should get you accustomed to that world. You should start to feel settled into that world, which is then when the inciting incident happens, when it starts to get really exciting, because then you're like, oh, I was settled in and now something's happening, and it gets really fun at that point, But we want as a reader, I want to feel settled when that inciting incident happens, because I want to feel how the character feels. And the character's probably going to feel thrown off by that inciting incident. So we have to set up that world so that you feel comfortable there too.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, you have to know what's normal so you know what's different. And that only builds tension in the reader. It's like if we get comfortable, it just builds tension. I mean, to go back to the opening in Harry Potter, there doesn't have to be a whole lot about living with the Dursleys. I mean, what we learn is the odd part, that they're so very normal and sure to be normal. We don't have to go into what it is to be a Muggle, because we're all Muggles. So we get to see what it's going to be like, what might be different, and it gets exciting. Scout doesn't think it's exciting.
I'd like to also say something that I see a ton of in manuscripts is a first chapter that starts out with a bang in terms of action. That there's a big event that happens right away and without setting up the ordinary world. So I wonder if you all would be able to speak to that a little bit. What happens when you introduced action without that contrast?
I love in media res. I love it. I think it can work really well if that scene that you're building, it should not be the inciting incident. That's key. The inciting incident needs to come later, but this sets our character up in some way. It's going to reveal character. It's going to provide forward movement with the plot in some way, and it is still going to, in some way, show us a little bit of ordinary world. It may not be exactly the ordinary world that we're expecting. It may not be the boring everyday that this character has, but this could be like one step below the inciting incident, and that still qualifies as ordinary world. So, for example, if you're writing a story about a student athlete, and the scene, the action scene is about a game, a soccer game that this athlete is taking place in, that you can write that in a way that is very action oriented and play by play, and somebody gets injured, or even the main character gets injured in this scene, for example. As long as that injury is not the inciting incident, again, clarifying that, it can still be part of that ordinary world, because this is something that does happen. This is something that occurs. This character plays this game frequently or whatever. But in media res can be a really good way of grabbing your reader's attention, as long as it's also still creating character, showing us the character.
Americans.
That's so key. Sorry. I was just because if you don't care, it doesn't matter. I mean, how many times have you read a beginning where the character's being chased through the forest and it's like, oh, catch her already. tired of the tripping and the angst and the moon creeping through the leaves. And it's like, just catch her, and then we can figure out what's going on.
Right.
So we need, just as you said, Jay, we have to have something that will connect us, though, and that will make us care for this character in this circumstance.
Right.
Incredibly important. And I'm sorry, Denise, I just...
No, I was going to say it's not necessarily action, but I think American Street did this.
Oh,
Yeah, because it
love that
starts with
book.
her, but if I'm remembering correctly, it starts with the main character, like, at immigration in the airport.
Yeah.
And so you're not necessarily, so I would say that she's not necessarily what we would typically think of as ordinary world. I think she goes through an emotional journey that, like, is definitely different, but, like, she's starting out a bit in crisis, you know, and I think it's really well done.
It's beautiful. That is one of my favorite books of 2017. I absolutely adored that book.
It was a really well done book, and I think if you are thinking about, like, starting a character in crisis of some kind, it's a good example of it being well done.
Yeah.
But you would probably need to, I haven't read it, but now it's going to go on my TBR pile.
Oh, it must.
Very
It
good.
absolutely must.
So good.
It must.
But I'm just thinking, but what we're getting with that, what it sounds like we're getting with that is, even though this might not be a crisis that many of us are familiar with, it's going to be an emotion that many of us are familiar with.
Yes.
That's how we
because
connect.
because she's losing her mother, and we're not giving anything away. You know this going into the story. Yeah. She loses her mother. Her mother is detained at immigration in New York, and then she has to go on to Detroit to her family. So she's torn away from her mother right away in the very beginning of the book. And if that's not an emotional connection to the character, I don't know what is.
And it's one we probably all understand in some way. That there's that crisis. So even though we're surrounded by an incident that may be totally foreign to us, it's the emotion we get, and so there we are. We're in a place where, I care for her because I lost my mother, or I got lost in the mall, or I remember being adrift when I thought that I was secure. And I mean, that's a very common human emotion. So it still fulfills those requirements, even though we are caught up in something so perhaps foreign to us.
I would also add, these are excellent points. I'm learning so much from this conversation, guys. I mean, you guys are awesome. So, I would add that, in addition to all of these points, the ordinary world should also conjure a mood, or an image or a metaphor that will suggest or give the reader a frame of reference for the rest of the story. I think that's what Christopher Vogler does that's what he talks about in his book, The Writer's Journey. And he talks about approaching it with a mythological approach, I think, and using metaphors to convey the hero's feelings about life and so on. And that clearly applies to fantasy novels. I think a good example for this is the classic The Wizard of Oz. And so there again, in the ordinary world, in Dorothy's ordinary world, if we look at the movie, the ordinary world is actually depicted in black and white. And everything, all the events that mirror what she's about to encounter is actually in Technicolor. So there's that special world, and there's the ordinary world. And I think, Denise, you talked about how Vogler, he talks about how posing an inner and outer question, I think, in the beginning. And that's really something that the hero becomes, the hero really wants in the ordinary world. And then in Dorothy's story, we know that the outer problem is that Toto has dug up this flower bed and everyone is too busy preparing for the storm to help her out. And the inner problem is that she has lost her parents and she doesn't feel at home anymore and she's incomplete and she really wants to get out of Kansas, right? So I think it's an excellent example when it comes to generally conjuring up the mood and the image and the metaphor that suggests a theme that the reader can look forward to in the rest of the story. And we recognize the difference when she actually encounters a special world in Technicolor.
That's
And
a
you
great
said we were
example.
smart.
I know,
Come
seriously.
And I think you bring up a good point, Suma, as it relates to as well, like the idea of your audience. When you're writing for kids, especially, I think it's important to consider our popular media. Like, what are they, like, challenging that and pushing against that and pushing against what they're used to, but also recognizing that we're all pretty used to a 3-act story, an inciting incident, a midpoint, a denouement, all of these things. And so I think that when you're setting up the beginning of a story, if you're thinking about this whole structure, what is the whole structure of the book that you're about to write? Are you about to write a traditional 3-act story? And I think, and I could, probably go on and on about this from it relates to like, pushing against those norms. But then also the value of that, right? Like a 3-act structure when you're dealing with something really tough is really nice for especially a younger audience because it's something familiar for them when you're dealing with something that's maybe really challenging for them to read. But that's all that said, all that aside, knowing the structure overall of what you're trying to accomplish over the whole book is going to help you understand what you need at the beginning as well. Because if you're writing something that's in an abnormal structure, that's in surrealist or some that just is pushing against those boundaries, that beginning might not look like those checklists that we've been talking about. It might look like something totally different. And so having an understanding of that, I think, is going to really help you when you come back to where that starting point is. I think what you bring up about Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is a really great point. The world came alive for her when she went into the fantasy world. And so for her, the ordinary world needed to not be so alive. And for all of us, that was black and white and, getting into new technology and then wanting to do that too. But that said, from a story angle, the black and white is not alive as the color that she experiences when she goes in that fantasy world.
And I do want to say as a caveat, because we have these craft chats, which I really, really enjoy. And I think as a writer myself and as somebody who can get really easily overwhelmed by craft books and people telling me, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. What Denise is saying is a really good point. It doesn't all have to follow this exact formula all the time, always. But what we're talking about is something that helps to direct you when you're looking for direction. And I think the way I always look at this type of conversation is it's really important to know the basics before you go off-road. It's really important to know why, how, but also why we're telling you this is how to do it. Yes, we're saying make sure you have a character desire, but the reason we're saying that is because without knowing what the character wants, the pacing is going to slow down. We're not going to be as invested in turning that page because we haven't been given a question to consider. We don't need to find the answer out right away, so we're not looking at turning that page as quickly. And all of these elements that we're asking you to introduce in the first chapter, we're asking for a reason, and hopefully you've been able to glean that from the conversations that we're having here today. So that's my PSA for the chat.
I think that's a really great point, Kate. I think that you need to understand the rules before you break them. And then when you choose to break a rule, make sure that you're breaking it for a particular reason, not just because you feel like it. There needs to be a legitimate reason that makes sense for your novel, for your story, for your character before you go ahead and break that rule. That's what I would, that's the advice that I would give to clients.
Yeah, and I would add on to what you said, Kate. I mean, another reason I think that I always go back to desire is like, why do we read in the first place? And we read to watch a character go on a journey, and we're all about what we want and going after what we want. That's what humans do. So that's what we want to see in characters more often than not. It's not to say that, especially when you're getting into adult books, things I think move in a different direction sometimes than what we're talking about today. But like, I do think that it's super important, and that people are always going to want to come back to following a character's desire and seeing if they get what they want, because that's what we're all trying to do as humans. And reading is a wonderful way to sort of explore other people going out and doing those things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's sharing the experience. We only get one life to live unless we're good readers. Then we get a whole lot.
Yeah, I like that, Jen.
Okay, so I just want to wrap up. If anybody has anything to say that they didn't get a chance to say, please feel free to interrupt me. But just want to wrap up by saying that we talked today about incorporating all of these big elements into your novel: character voice, desire, ordinary world, conflict, inciting incident, setting. And I'd like to end by having everybody talk about where people can find you if they're interested in hiring you to edit their manuscript. And also, if you wouldn't mind mentioning one of your favorite, we've talked a lot about different examples of openings that get it right in novels, but if you could name a book that is like one of your favorite novel openings, that would be great.
Well, I am at jwhistler on Twitter. My website is jwhistler.com. And you can also find me at angelellaeditorial.com. That is the name of the website, right? angelellaeditorial.com. Right. Okay. I just need to make sure. There are too many books that get it right. The Season of Styx Malone has a really great opening. I mean, exactly, those kids want adventure. They want excitement, and they want to hang out with Styx.
One of them does. One wants
one of them. Well, that's true. Well, in the very first page, it says they both want it.
That's true.
It says they both want it, but that's what it says in the very first page. But gosh, I can't. There are just too many that get the beginning right. The first Harry Potter. I mean, we've talked about so many, so I can't pick one, Kate. That's just cruel.
I did it on purpose.
You're mean.
I'll go next, I guess. You can find my website is denisesantamaro.com. I'm on Twitter at DA and Instagram at Denise Santamaro. If you want to hire me as an editor, you should also check out angelellaeditorial.com. And I didn't stick with like my favorite rule breaker. I decided to go with something I'd read recently instead. And I'm actually going to go with the 57 Bus, going back to that. I loved the way that they opened the book. I'm, obviously not ruining anything because it's the first page, but you find out in the first section, basically the event that caused these two individuals to come together and to have their stories cross. And in a book, in like a novel, that would probably be like the lead up to what's going to happen, right? But since this was nonfiction, I kind of loved that she just got it out of the way. It had been in the news. There had been articles that had been written about this event, which, for those of you who don't know, Boy lit a transgender person's skirt on fire and caused very terrible, terrible burns on this person's legs. And this book takes it out of that, right? Like, that's the article, that's the clickbait, that's the piece that everybody knows. And so she got it out of the way at the beginning so that we could focus on something else, which I really think was well done. And I think in terms of sort of, we talk so much about like building to intention and all of these things, but sometimes it's just sort of a way of showing the rules being broken. I think that the tension is not in the event. We all know the event. Now let's focus on something else, which is these two individuals and how they got there and what happened after, which I thought was just really well done.
Well, I can go. So you can find me, my website is jenbailey.com, and it's Jen with 2 N's, so Jenn. And then Bailey has Bailey. I'm on Twitter as Jen Bailey. And you can find me at Angelella Editorial as well. I'm on Instagram as something, I don't know, something very Jen Bailey-ish. Could be Jen C. Bailey, I'm not sure. But you can find me at those places. And I'm going to do like Denise's, she opened the door. So a lot of books, I think, get that beginning right. But one that I read most recently was The Collectors by Jacqueline West. I'm finding myself looking at that book more and more. And the beginning, the first chapter has you don't meet the main characters at all. What you get to see is an event. But what is laid bare for you, as I've stated before, is that promise of what this story is going to be about. And there's enough there that there is the desire is there. You as the reader have a desire. And when you meet the character's desire matches your own. And so immediately you're like, okay, I'm following him because he's going to get me what I need to know. And I think that it's a really interesting way. So we're not starting with character. This is one of those things where you know the rule and you go ahead and break it a little bit. But we are definitely starting with a desire line. And we're definitely starting with viewing the ordinary world in an extraordinary way. And that makes us latch onto that main character hard when we finally meet him and realize that he's seeing what we're seeing. He saw what we just experienced, and he's the only one. So we need to follow him. And it's a very interesting way to begin a story.
I guess it's my turn. I just was lost in all your stories. So my name again is Suma, and you can find me on Twitter at Suma_V_S. I think that's where I have my name really short. Everywhere else it's too long, so you might as well find me on Twitter, and or you can find me on Angelella Editorial for sure. I'm going to follow suit in terms of what Denise and Jen did. The book that I'm going to talk about is Veera Hiranandani's The Night Diary, which is the 2019 Newbery Honor Book. I think it's a beautiful story about the pain of partition between India and Pakistan, and it's set in 1947 in the present Pakistan, and it's told from the point of view of a young girl, Nisha. So Nisha lives with her family, and in a town that was once peaceful, but now it's beginning to encounter strange times, and it begins to matter what religion someone belongs to. And what the author does in the opening is Nisha begins writing in her diary on the day the novel opens. And if you look at the diary, it's actually, if you read about the diary, it's actually covered in purple and red silk and decorated with small sequins and sewn in like bits of mirrored glass. Not the right kind you would think for a story that's set in such a dark time. But if you look, and the paper itself is rough and thick, and it has the color of butter. So maybe it's really the right kind after all. And it's a book that's given to her by a character that's very close to her, and it was at the time when he tells her that she needs to start writing things down, and someone needs to record things that will happen because grown-ups will become too busy. And that sets the tone for the story. So that was something that I really enjoyed.
And I want to make a quick correction.
I have that book right here.
Yes,
That book.
it's so good. It's such a beautiful book. I want to make a quick correction. I said transgender. I was wrong. The teen in the 57 bus is agender, not transgender. My bad.
And my name is Kate Angelella, and you can find me at Kate Angelella on Twitter, and Angelella Editorial website. And we also have a Twitter handle for Angelella Editorial, where all of our editors tweet from at Angel Editors. You can subscribe to our YouTube for our bi-monthly craft chats like this one, which are completely free. And also we have a monthly craft chat or monthly word nerd chat on Twitter, where it's all about you guys, all about the writers, and we get to hear a little bit about your habits and rituals of writing. And that is the first Monday of every month at 9 Eastern. Next one, I believe, is May 6th. And we have another craft chat coming up on April 29th, which is the complement to this one on how to nail the ending of your novel. My choice of book with the best beginning is also a recent one, which is the Heart in a Body in the World. And the reason I love that so much is because it's a little bit atypical, but it does suspense so well. The first chapter is actually the ordinary world is the aftermath of a terrible tragedy that the main character has experienced. And the conflict that takes place in the first chapter is not the main conflict for the entire novel, but it is an inciting incident. It does set the events into motion for the novel. And what's great about this book is that it maintains the suspense that it sets up in chapter ones for the duration of the novel. It is as intense as it is in the first chapter, every single chapter thereafter until the very last one. So it's pretty impressive to me. So we thank you guys for joining us. We're so glad that you could, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next craft chat on April 29th. Thanks, everybody.